Our third and last speaker of this morning's panel is Orlando Hernandez Ying, who is an alumni from the Universidad de Santa Maria la Antigua Mass Communication program. In 2001, as a Fulbright scholar, he completed his MA in the Museum Studies at New York University, and in 2009, he received his PhD in art history at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, focusing on Latin American art of all eras, so from pre-Columbian to modern. He has taught at NYU, the New York School in New York, and Tulane University in New Orleans. He has also worked in various capacities at MoMA, the Brooklyn Museum, the Hispanic Society of America, and the New Orleans Historical Collection in the United States, and the Anthropological Museum Reina Torres de Arose, Marta, we will hear all about it, and the Panama Canal Museum in his native Panama. In 2014, he was appointed Panama's National Director of Museums, managing 18 museums under the National Institute of Culture. Orlando, por favor.
Thank you very much for the Getty Research Institute for this wonderful opportunity to come here and share a project for which I feel particularly attached to, just not only for being Panamanian, but also because I think it's a little bit embarrassing to be up here and see all the developments that are going on in the rest of the hemisphere. And in spite of the economical situation that we are enjoying in Panama, unfortunately we cannot count as many advances as our neighbors. Thank you again to Tomás, Kim, Elena, Aleka, Marisa, and Jennifer for all the efforts. I got that right there. For all the efforts to have us here. I felt very welcome, and for me it's an honor to participate in this event and share laughter and knowledge with such a great group of scholars. So thank you very much. As I said before, it's an opportunity to expose a little bit of our dirty laundry in Panama, so I'm going to try to do it like the most decent way possible. This talk aims to document and discuss the rescue efforts for the Museo Antropológico Reina Torres de Araúz, also known as Marta. For decades, the only museum in Panama. After years of apogee as part of the curriculum of local schools, the museum went into a slow decline, ending in blunt negligence. The national collection of approximately 16,000 objects, ranging from pre-Columbian gold and ceramics to regional folk costumes, has also endured war, in the 1989 Just Cause effort to oust Noriega, looting in 2003 called the Centennial Robbery, actually with the operation of collaborators of the museum, unfortunately, and significant deterioration as well as the building once the Panama Railroad Station built in 1912. In the first decades of the 21st century, as Panama enjoyed a burgeoning economy and polarized world attention with the widened canal and financial scandal, the museum silently fell in disarray and abandonment until it closed its doors, leaving an indelible mark in the collective sense of national identity of a still adolescent nation. We have to remember that opposed to the fact that in South America, the countries were getting their independence in the early 1800s, as well as in Central America, Panama decided to voluntarily join Colombia for another 83 years. Plus, we had a very important, a significant presence of the United States Army in the Panama Canal Zone, also debilitating or weakening the sense of national identity and national pride and worth. Today, after years of not exhibiting its permanent collection, a new effort to awaken this dormant giant poses significant political and economic challenges, as well as much to be done in terms of conservation, reconceptualization of its mission, aims and message, plus decades of upgrading and updating the museum's equipment, facilities, and amenities. These challenges are also great opportunities to rethink the museum's direction and tailor it to its new globalized, technologically savvy audience. Entire generations of national and foreign visitors who have missed the experience of exploring Panama's cultural roots through the dialogues that only occur in museum setting. As the eye of global commerce turned to Panama with the opening of the new Panama Canal in the navel of the world, as Panamanians like to call their country, behind a curtain of concrete, glass, and steel constructions that make up Panama's skyline lies a collection of approximately 16,000 pre-Columbian and ethnographic objects. This talk aims to document the rescue efforts of an important place of reference in terms of Panamanian cultural identity and material culture. The Anthropological Museum located in Plaza Cinco de Mayo, and has nothing to do with the Battle of Puebla, but with a big fire that unfortunately sacrificed the lives of several firemen in the early 20th century. It's also a crossroad of Panamanians and a witness to many historical and political events throughout Panama's Republican life. The Museo Antropológico Reina Torres de Araúz, also known as Marta, and I'm calling it that since now, was at one point the only museum in Panama. Marta was named after anthropologist and ethnographer Reina Torres de Araúz, who single-handedly created not only the Museo del Hombre Panameño, the original name for Marta, but also around 15 more regional museums and exhibitions with the support of the military government of Omar Torrijos. He was the predecessor of Noriega. The museums, I believe, were part of his campaign to forge a new and more inclusive discourse of Panamanian national identity, which was rooted in the pre-Columbian past and indigenous populations, but also included the multi-ethnic and multicultural contributions of the immigrant populations that make up the country as we know it today, among which were Jews, Indians, and the Chinese, to mention just a few. As a fourth grader, I remember drawing one of the dioramas where the Haibana, or the Waunan medicine man, healed a patient under a thatched roof miniature hut after a school visit. It was, so what I want to say with this is that the experience of the museum, especially the theatricality of the dioramas, are very well ingrained in the Panamanian collective memory. In order to understand Marta's history in the chronological sequence, it is necessary to start with its building. So I'll give you 2 seconds to read that. The building served as the Pacific terminal of the Panama Canal Railway, the terrestrial interoceanic route parallel to the Panama Canal. As he did in the United States, architect Edwin Bartlett designed the Panama Railway Station and furnishings. The federal-style building was completed 2 years before the completion of the Panama Canal in 1914. The design and treatment of the Panama Station was, according to the canal record, and I quote, it was a free adaptation of the stucco architecture of Palladio as found in Vicenza and nearby cities in northeastern Italy. A two-story Doric colonnade crowned with a balustrade and terminated at the ends of the entrance pavilions forms the motif of the main facade. The building's design mirrored a Penn Station in New York at a very modest scale. It featured a main waiting hall upon which the travelers entered through the 2 vestibules which enforced the institutionalized form of segregation among canal workers, known as Gold Roll and Silver Roll. The railroad station was strategically located right on the central avenue in front of a plaza that later staged many political and social demonstrations throughout the 20th century, charging both plaza and building with historical significance in the collective memory of Panamanians. The building stopped serving as a railroad station around 1960, and it remained vacant until the mid-70s when it was repurposed as a museum. Unfortunately, the socioeconomic decline of Marta's neighborhood in the second half of the 20th century turned it into one of the most impoverished and dangerous zones in the metropolitan area. However, the location proves to be relevant once more in the building's role as a museum since it's located right at the center of Panama City, with accessibility by foot from Casco Antiguo, Panama's old quarter, as well as through a 20-minute metro ride from the outskirts of the city. Considering this situation, Marta's project was among has among its objectives not only rescuing the collection and the building, but serving as an agent to revitalize the area by making the neighboring populations part of the museum's community and activities. This is still a project on the works, but from what I have seen, what we have experienced from the old quarter of Panama City called Casco Antiguo, that has suffered or has endured under the rubric of preservation, is undergoing a severe situation of gentrification, and the people have been, the original, well, I wouldn't say original, but the tenants of the old buildings in the old quarter have been displaced to the campaign of repopulated with restaurants and stores catering to foreign interests and tourism, rather than to keep some of the authenticity of the old quarter. I think it's very important that when we are trying to envision plans to change and supposedly improve historical areas, we have to keep some of that in mind rather than turning it into Disney World. Unfortunately, the socioeconomic decline of Marta's neighborhood in this, I'm sorry, I read that. So we're trying to incorporate in our museum projects and programs when we have a museum to recover some of those jobs and activities that were performed in and are still performed around the neighborhood of the museum, in terms of having an authenticity and not to displace the original inhabitants of the area by gentrification and charging more prices or higher prices for real estate and services around the museum. In the 1970s, Torrijos ceded the empty building to Reina Torres. The institution was named the Museum of Panamanian Man, and it was inaugurated in 1976. The museum was inspired in an anthropological view that followed the example of the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and simultaneously tried to document all the ethnic groups, foreign and local, that conform Panamanian population, always focusing on the heterogeneous, multi-ethnic, and multicultural nature of Panamanian identity. For years, school visits were mandatory for public and private schools, leaving permanent memories in young visitors. This is an unfortunate mistake that happened a couple of years ago as the neighborhood went into decline in terms of socio-economic and not only became more impoverished, but also burdened with crime. Since it's a crossroads for many Panamanians to take mass transportation, and in order to sort of like solve the problem of having bus stops, the government and the authorities of transport and transit decided to put this covering in front of the museum, and a lot of Panamanian art historians, anthropologists, and other scholars were so adamant in criticizing this that a year later they had to take it off. Unfortunately, because of the homeless people that also inhabit around this area, they started making home in front of the museum in the colonnade, and a fence had to be built to protect the building from having people just make their homes there. And that has also created like a barrier between the building and the public that we are in hopes of tearing down. In terms of the collection, is composed of approximately 16,000 objects featuring diverse artifacts that range from modern indigenous clothes to pre-Columbian medals and life-size stone sculptures, plus thousands of ceramic vessels whose styles identify regions and periods of Panama's archaeological history. Among the most important and unique artifacts are the gold chest plates and ornaments from Sitio Conte, located in the central area of the country and produced between 450 and 900 CE. We also have the basalt stone chieftains from Sitio Barriles, near the border with Costa Rica, carved between 300 and 900 CE. Some of which are displayed in museums that have become strong allies to Marta, while we cannot exhibit any of our collections because the building is in complete disarray and we use it basically as a storage unit. We have created partnerships with neighboring museums and institutions to be able to at least display and exhibit some of the wealth that we own in the museum so that it's accessible for the public in Panama and other international scholars. We also have the estile from El Caño, from the central area of the country, ranging from 700 to 1,000 of the Common Era. And the necropolis has been recently featured in international press after the extraordinary discoveries of funerary and sumptuary artifacts by Fundación El Caño. And these are on display right now in Fundación El Caño in the City of Knowledge. An international enclave where universities and other institutions have places to do research and classrooms and programs for the purposes of education. And now we come to the issue. The museum went into decadence following its founder's passing in 1982. Subsequent governmental authorities also abandoned the institution. The Conservation Center for Pre-Columbian Art, another of the museum's activities with support of the Organization of American States, closed its doors. The exhibitions were never renovated and the building did not receive proper maintenance. In 1989, the museum was vandalized during Operation Just Cause to oust Noriega, and the gold collection was stolen in 2003 by collaborators of the museum. Only 85% of the gold artifacts were recovered. That's why the images for the gold are so, I had to pillage them from the internet because now we have them in bank vaults, and I think I'm just gonna see them when they're going right into the display cases and then from the bank into the cases, and that's it. We don't want to have materials like that in the museum right now because we don't have the security systems to really keep them safe. In 2006, well, here you have some more examples of the wealth of the collection. We have ceramics from all parts of the country, not only identified by commonalities between the cultural areas of Gran Chiriquí, Gran Coclé, and Gran Darien, but also among, especially in the Gran Coclé area, which is the central area of the country. They have been identified by the towns in which they were located, identifying particular styles and chronologies. In 2006, under the complaints of ruinous facilities and with the opportunity of seizing a brand new building donated by the Taiwanese embassy for a children's interactive museum, the entire collection was wrapped up and transported to this new facility. The facility, however, lacked the technical equipment to keep the collections properly. Eventually, the collection was relocated in storage in the building's attic and poorly maintained and stored. And this is where our nightmare gets worse. I'm very fortunate and pleased. I think this is also a great opportunity and a great venue. If you can assist us in any way, and I make this open call not only to the Getty Research Institute, but anyone of the in the audience that has access to help us in order to catalog, inventory, organize the storage areas. We are very welcome to carry on conversations about it. We are very welcoming of helping hands to help us with this daunting task. So this is what I found in 2012 when I arrived when I first started working with the Institute of Culture. There was a plan by the government of by the presidential by the Presidential and the Institute of Culture of the last period to abandon the premises with the collection because the whole thing was going to be turned into the City of the Arts. Since its creation in around 1972, the Institute of Culture and all the institutions that are organized under its governance, such as the Symphonic Orchestra, the National Ballet, the art schools, the direction of publications and literature, all of those things are living in rental buildings all around, scattered all around the city of Panama. So the idea was to centralize everything in a huge complex in which that would also allow for connections and exchanges between all these different disciplines. It sounded good in writing. However, it was done in the last year of the last presidential turn. So it was one of these like projects that they wanted to really rush through in order, and with multi-million dollar budgets. And unfortunately, and I must admit it, you know, the cases of corruption in Panama and Latin America are something that are really causing a very dramatic situation for all the cultural not only the institutional part of it, but also the physical aspect of all the facilities, all the buildings and monuments that are under this meaning. So this is more or less what we found there in terms of the situation of the storage area. We have the collection ultimately in the last years, while it was in this other newer building, were displaced to the attic, and we're talking about metallic vaults, semicircular vaults, and the air conditioning unfortunately was not maintained, and the problem with cycling and the heating of Panamanian tropical sun during the day, and then the cooling off of this metallic structure at night. We are very fortunate, and the pre-Columbian peoples knew what they were doing and how they were cooking these materials, because thank God nothing really terrible happened. Unfortunately, what we did lose were all the organic materials from the ethnographic collections, all the basketry, fibers, and other organic materials we had, unfortunately, to discard because in the risk, to avoid the risk of infestation of other collections. Also, it was like an episode of Hoarders where you had like people with old materials from old exhibitions still being preserved and put in the same room, and sometimes in the same boxes with historical material. It was a real nightmare, and all the things that I've learned in my coursework of conservation, and those nightmares were a reality in this building. And I'm gonna be more colloquial about this because it's just like so daunting. So dust buildup. So all the no-nos of museums were basically found here. We found raccoons, all sorts of rodents. It was really something very dramatic. For me as a Panamanian, after having the opportunity to study here and see the state-of-the-art museums that we have in Panama, for me it was really shocking to see our heritage like thrown on the floor. The great sculptures are just like lying underneath staircases. Nothing was padded, nothing was organized by material, just everything was thrown with computer monitors, old signage. It was really a chaotic nightmare. In this, with these particular objects, someone had the bright idea to like put a black cloth over them, and also we had we call them pilones. They are like two cones connected by the narrower part that were used by the people in the countryside to grind and clean the rice from its shrub, from its covering. And they, as part of a more vivid representation of how the pilones were used, someone decided to put the real grains in it. So, and then the black covering over it, making a perfect hotel for rodents and other pests. Also, as we had mock burials in these acrylic cases that were kept after the exhibitions were discarded, and it was really difficult to convince the people from the Institute to just discard these elements. And at that point, I was only the curator in the collection, and I was not the director, so I had to follow orders, and I tried to explain, what was the situation if we kept collecting all of these materials that were not part of the collection, but that didn't serve a purpose anymore. But people would just stand there and not do anything. And I just grabbed a shovel and started. So we also, and the most important thing that I learned from this experience is that what we read in books and what we see here in the United States and in Europe is a state-of-the-art museums where we are enjoying great technology, people that are trained for this, but then we also have to step it down and realize that the situation in some places in Latin America is not the same, and we have to work with what we have, which is something that Francisco very well put in his lecture as well. So we took advantage of this Google platform in order to create a very simple questionnaire in which anybody could just sit down and jot down what they found in each box. We had 2 tables with around 12 people working for approximately 6-7 months, just jotting down what we found, photographing everything, and rewrapping everything and separating everything by material. This very, very simple work, I think, that can extend the life of the collection for some time. But at the same time, my heart was breaking because I was like, okay, we're using just regular acidic boxes and we're wrapping it with bubble wrap, but that's the only thing that the museum and the institution had at the time. So it's really difficult to see the bar of the elements and the materials that you have to work with, and then face the reality of the things that you really have to work with. It's still, I still have pending that we have to change all of this, so it's we're thinking very hardly about that. So we created this this platform in which anyone, just without any sort of preparation in museum studies or conservation or anything, could just jot down the information, and we could have at least an inventory of how many objects we had, and the materials, and in what boxes they were stored, and in what location. We also put this little cotton strings with cardboard signs with the accession numbers for some materials, so we avoided the handling or the overhandling, especially of very heavy objects such as the metates. At this point, and I remember when this picture was taken, actually this was taken with my phone, since the air conditioner was not working, the temperature there was like a sauna. It was like Bikram yoga, but then you have to lift the stones in order to really put the string around it. It was a very, very hard job. And the results, although they're not perfect, I feel very proud about this with the team that helped me carry it out, because we now know where to find things, how many we have, and we have a photographic record of all the collection. Even though they're not by unit, we at least know that in that box we have 3 objects, and we can find them if we want. So, of course, it had to be signed by just everyone in the museum. We cannot avoid the bureaucracy of that. which was not really, I mean, and I have to be really candid about this, and and please forgive me if I'm not being like specific, too technical about this. But then the amount of objects was so overwhelming, and sometimes the people weren't there like the whole time, and sometimes the signatures don't actually mean anything. So it's what I want to say with this is that sometimes we, especially in Panama, we're trying to control something of which we don't really have a control, and even though it's necessary, we really have to be like realistic about this and really like trust the people that we're working with. So, and that is another thing that we really have to work with in terms of trusting the people that we're working with, and when with the looting of 2003, this has become also an issue. So this is the result of what we did, and we have, now the collection is more or less organized. It was transported from that new building into we looked all over the country. Everything was too expensive to afford by the Institute of Culture. We're not even a ministry. That's another situation that we have in Panama. The people are very suspicious about the institutionality of the government and its institutions, and that makes the work more difficult. And then, well, we have the programs. Well, we transported everything back to Plaza Cinco de Mayo, which was the only facility that we could actually afford, and actually the museum the collection went back to its home. The house, or the building in Plaza Cinco de Mayo, is shared also with the National Ballet, the School of Theater, and the place where we gather all the materials that are disseminated throughout the institution, such as paper, inks, computers, cleaning supplies. So the whole way in which the Institute of Culture is operating is very rudimentary, and we need to really reformat and re-engineer the whole institution and turn it into a ministry with better budgets and better organization. So when I was appointed in 2015 as the coordinator of museums, I started working parallelly to the fact of creating a patronato or a foundation for the museum that would allow us to operate with private and public efforts. I put together a team, and we started working on a mission. The Institute of Culture is making great efforts to rescue Marta's building and collection through the creation of a patronato with members from the public and private sector, and whose roles are similar to a board of trustees. It has been a long process of legal approval by the National Assembly. It was approved on third debate in January 2017 and sanctioned by the executive 3 months later. That happened last month. In the meantime, a team of experts has worked on the draft of the museum's mission. The Museo Antropológico Reina Torres de Araúz Marta is a permanent, non-profit institution open to the public that serves society and its development, which acquires, conserves, interprets, investigates, and disseminates knowledge about the human manifestations studied by anthropology, archaeology, ethnography, art history, music, literature, and other cultural manifestations idiosyncratic of Panamanian people and its human print, understood as an integral component of Panamanian national identity and its tangible and intangible wealth, with the purposes of study, education, and enjoyment. So that's our draft as of now. In terms of programs, the museum wants not only to research and document the manifestations of culture during the pre-Columbian era, which is the strength of our collection, but also to document the practices of indigenous and foreign ethnicities that compose the melting pot of Panamanian identity today, and rescue some of the practices of modern Panamanians that have not been documented. The ultimate objective with the programs is to build bridges between the different communities that conform Panamanian population, so each individual can recognize its cultural roots, but as a member of a large national community that takes pride in its diversity. And I remember when I was a boy, people who listened to Panamanian folk music were the people that were doing the help in the houses. Nobody wanted to hear salsa. That was also like something music for poor people, for black people. Now those things have changed, and I think we're right now in a very important crossroads. And as you can see, when we see the skyline of Panama, when we see the widened canal, the Bio Museum, the new airport that we're having built, it's not congruous with what's going on in terms of culture. And I think that this is a sign of the extreme neoliberalist policies that are taking place in our government, and unfortunately they are permeating in the whole community with a huge sacrifice from the cultural sector. As I have told some of my colleagues in conversations, in casual conversations, the most important monuments in Panama are in terrible danger. The cathedral is under works, the museum, you have seen it, the forts in Portobelo and San Lorenzo, and what's the other one? I forgot. Well, those three are very important. The National Theater and the museum are all part of this endangered situation buildings. Some of the ideas that have emerged along the lines is a program to link educational programs with the museum exhibits through school visits, of course, as well as to have a restaurant open to the public where local chefs can cook traditional recipes in front of an audience, talking about the historical origins of certain dishes, as well as the inclusion of an orchard with local herbs and spices used for medicinal purposes by indigenous populations. We're also thinking about having our audio guides in vernacular indigenous languages and incorporating and inviting them to tell their own stories in the museum. So this is our part of the projections that how we want to see the museum and the programs and activities of the museum would be like. In terms of budget, Marta's rehabilitation project is in the process of creating a board of trustees, as I said before, which will include representatives from the government, of course, the National Institute of Culture, the Town Hall, and the Tourism Authority, plus members of the private sector and academia, upon which we plan to invite the Panamanian Association of Anthropology and History and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. The museum is financing the rehabilitation of its building and facilities through a loan from the Inter-American Bank of Development with the objective of preservation of Panama's material culture. The loan of approximately $8.5 million will serve to create, first and foremost, a storage facility to house the collection and renovate the building for its museum purpose. In 2019, not only an election year, but also the 500th anniversary of the foundation of Panama City is also marked by the celebration in Panama of the World Youth Day, marked with a visit by Pope Francis. So on top of all the situation that we have right now, we also have a big celebration coming up, and we need to be ready for it. Before I felt a little bit more optimistic about having something open by 2019. Most probably it's going to be just like a small inaugural exhibition, and the rest of the museum is going to be in works. I still feel optimistic, but I no longer feel the pressure of having something ready by 2019. We have to be realistic. And I think, after all, the Mesoamerican populations were not bad at all. I think after every 5 years, at least in Panama, we have an apocalypse and renovation, and we'll see where we are in 2020. Also, Panama has been designated the cultural capital of Iberoamerica in 2019, an international event which Marta would like to be ready with at least an inaugural exhibition. And what we have, I'm sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. What we have here are the zonifications that we have explored with other museum specialists that have come from Mexico to help us out, and architects to design the gallery spaces and the spaces for academic programs and administrative spaces and so on. So we have zoned that already, but we are in the process of hiring a company or an architect that does the whole thing, design, construction, supervision. So we're hoping that will work. Unfortunately, also, another one of the problems that we have, because of the scandals of corruption and the difficulty of participating in competitions as contractors for the government, a lot of people don't participate. So you prepare this document for 4 months, and then you put it out on the online platform for contractors to participate, and nobody wants to participate with the government. So it was very important for, at least in Panama, to have institutions protected by Board of Trustees and work with private and in a conjoint venture between private and public, because otherwise I don't think that we'll be able to succeed. So these are some of the tasks that we still need to work on. But I think it's a long-term goal once the museum is established. We probably also have to take the collections to a different facility while the construction is being made. Also, the whole city is undergoing a huge renovation campaign in which the plot right next to the museum is being turned into an underground parking lot and a crafts market. So we're hoping to be able to interact with that facility later on. In conclusion, despite of all the challenges in terms of budget and short time frame to have it ready, Marta has 2 great assets: an extraordinary collection and a landmark building. In spite of the political tides and budgetary limitations, the National Institute of Culture has high hopes and is working diligently in all the processes needed to renovate the museum building, build a new storage facility, and prepare an inaugural exhibition for 2019. Marta is also in the process of networking all the key actors in the reopening of the museum, filling the gap of its absence in the last decades, allowing Panama's history and culture to catch up with its economic prosperity and improve interoceanic waterway, renovating and reinforcing a long sleeping giant, which is our sense of Panamanian national identity for the benefit and enjoyment of all its children. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. You fulfilled our hopes of what you would do. And I just wanted to say that the symposium is born not only out of the GRI's interest in the history of museums, especially our director's specific, which is our director's specific interest, but also from the travels all of us, Elena, Aleka, I, Tomas Gitgens, other members of the PST-involved curators have been conducting over the last 4 years, and we've all extensively traveled through Latin America and have thereby learned, we all have our specialties, but we've learned sort of more about the breadth and diversity of Latin America, more than we ever did before. And one of the first trips that I took was from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia, where I met a lot of these wonderful people. And we were so startled and struck by the diversity of the conditions of museums. And this panel today was, we specifically put, our colleagues here together because they could speak to this diversity of the conditions. And you've seen aspects of this, sort of how do the countries deal with, for example, the integration of indigenous and representation of indigenous cultures, pre-Columbian art, or in some cases lack or inclusion of pre-Columbian art, or inclusion or lack of representations of modern and contemporary art. So these are all these really interesting histories. And before I open it up to all of you, I just want to touch on this one subject of how does the governmental appointments, how do this sort of these cycles of governmental appointments affect really how your museums operate and can operate. And this is really different in all the 3 countries that you are representing. And what does this mean in terms of continuity or discontinuity of institutional expertise, of knowledge, as well as we've seen, especially with Agustin, the mission of museums. So maybe you could just sort of summarize and touch on that a little bit more? I mean, it was within all of your presentations, but like, what are the cycles of elections, and then who gets appointed, and are these always political appointments, or in some cases that does not happen? So maybe you could speak to that.
Well, in the case of Costa Rica, we have a very strong, we call civil service, so that guarantee that persons have continuity even though there's a change of government. The only position that changes is the director. And fortunately for the last 3 decades, they have been persons related with the fields of museums of archaeology or natural history. So there's a continuity. We have some curiosities about who is going to be the next director, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be a radical change. So in that case, in the case of at least of Costa Rica, there's no this instability that can be seen in other countries.
Well, in the case of Panama, it's much more dramatic, unfortunately, and again, sorry for my candidness, and probably I hope I can return to my country after this. But in Panama, the Institute of Culture, first it was, there were efforts to turn it into a ministry so it could enjoy a better budget, and the law was vetoed by the last president. And then, on the other hand, and it's a very unfortunate situation, it is the Institute of Culture, for the most part, I mean, with some exceptions, of course, of people that are doing their job and that they are prepared for it, it's more understood as a place where the coming president pays off electoral favors that have been given to him before. So sometimes we have people that have not even an interest in performing these jobs, but they are in that office for 5 years, and then some people also succumb to the public pressure and to rivalries within the institution and decide to quit, and then we have other people taking over their jobs that are less qualified or not even interested in the whole discipline. Putting in a very huge toll in all, not only in the museum, but in all the cultural sector, the theaters, the ballet, and everybody suffers from this situation. Unfortunately, I don't see a way in which a practice that has been so long can change radically, but hopefully with the results of the people that are working, that mindset will change.
Well, in the case of Mexico, it's, I would say, because of the scale of the country and the diversity of institutions that we have. You have from the private, individually owned museums to others that are run like non-for-profit organizations, and even when you, which have their own ways of doing things. And then when you talk about the state-owned institutions, you have to think in 2 levels. You have to think on federal level and also into state level. So there are many diverse ways. What I should say is that, fortunately enough, I think that what we are seeing in Mexico is a larger professionalization of the staff, and that younger generations are really being prepared to take on positions, and probably we have not left them much space yet, but I think that there's a certain respect within the field for colleagues and how things happen. So what used to be in a way very similar to what my colleagues here on the table are describing sort of had changed in years back. And although administrations change at the top, the people that had been performing in the field for a long time keep moving around. You know, probably we shuffled seats, but they basically still stay in within the directorship of institutions. I wish I could see something that with the new Minister of Culture would come into a more finding ways of looking for accountability and recognition, and especially long-term training and retention of staff, which is something that happens differently, for example, in Anthropological Institute, because most of the directors usually come from their own institution. It is different what happened with IMBA, because there's no such a thing like, there are research centers for IMBA, but very few people had come from that field into the leadership of museums.
So you can see three really different situations. So now I want to open up to questions from the audience. Anybody raise your hand, and please wait for the microphone to come your way.
This question was precipitated by Agustin's presentation, but I think might be germane to all three, which is the question of the mission of the museum and whether that's to tell a cultural narrative or an art historical narrative, whether those can be distinguished, what the tensions are between the two, how that played out in the 1982 founding of MUNAL and since, and then possibly how that is playing out in Costa Rica or Panama.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat it again, please?
The mission of the museum, how much of it is to tell a cultural narrative and how much of it is to tell an art historical narrative, and what possible tensions those are between those two.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, in the case of the museums in Costa Rica, there's a strong emphasis in the historical narrative, trying to provide a sense of continuity since the first settlers to today. There was this interest to be the place where you can understand the whole history, and that passed for the denial of the term prehistory. We don't use that term anymore. Instead of that, we say deep history or ancient history or say Costa Rica or pre-Columbian history. But what we try is to provide the current population with a sense of continuity since the first times to today, to exalt the indigenous component, and in that way try to counteract the previous discourse that exalted the wideness of the Costa Rican population. So, and also the arrangement of the building helps in that sense, because it's like a circular arrangement. So you can go from the first in populations of the territory, and then ending with a modern situation, and after that going out and see the city. It's like trying to connect all this. So it's a very strong, in a way, historical narrative. And during that process, we are also trying also to acknowledge the role of different groups. In the past, where the history of the Central Valley, where all the major population is located, and ignoring the periphery. Now it's trying to also take in account the other groups that are part of the Costa Rican identity. So it's combining, in a way, the two narratives. And we don't see like a tension between that. The thing is how to reconcile the two narratives in a way that all Costa Ricans feel that are participants of the exhibition. And then it's difficult, because at the beginning there was the idea to provide this idea of every inhabitant of this nation state was part of the same identity. And now is how to present the diverse situation of the country, the different identities. And many of those young Costa Ricans are people that were born from immigrant fathers or parents. So it's trying to provide this sense of diversity, and also to promote tolerance. That is the mission right now of the museum.
In the case of Panama, I think we're walking towards the same direction, but we are like 20 years behind. And we're walking towards also reconfiguring also the sense of national identity, which was originally coined as a criollo, white, elitist, Eurocentric discourse to a more inclusive, multi-ethnic, multicultural one. In terms of the archaeological part of the collection, that's perhaps going to be visited or conceptualized in chronology and periods of time and phases and so on. But in what we are envisioning for the ethnographic or in the ethnological part of the collection is probably to center on the cultures, and then once we identify them, then provide the bracket of time in which they operate or they establish themselves. But the discourses not being really conflicted with one another. But what we do need to do is to reconfigure the sense of national identity to really embody the whole Panamanian population with all its diversity.
I would say I like to speak only from the point of view of art museums. I can really engage with a larger conversation. And even within the art museum, it's such a big variety of institutions that it's difficult to narrow it down. What I can say is that there has been a long history that we have witnessed here with so many good presentations about the development of museums in Mexico. And what I actually think is happening is that there is no such a thing as a mission, in our institutions. Really, I mean, we don't sit down and think of building a strategic plan, and I see some of my colleagues from other latitudes kind of nodding like, yeah, and we don't have a large strategic plan and looking at how we're going to manage resources and human resources and all these things. But what I have to say is that the way that society has evolved is now challenging the political discourse that was set up from the state. Mm-hmm. And I think that the people that are coming on board to take leadership positions within the institutions are doing that themselves. I personally, that's what I try to do when I was in MUNAL for 3 years. But I think that we had been able, or we're at this point where we have enough historical distance to start thinking that there are other routes than ours. Hay más ruta que la nuestra. That there's much more that is, the very famous quote by Siqueiros and Rivera. I think that nowadays there's actually a large number of my colleagues that are questioning themselves from a very intellectual point of view what the narrative of museums should bring to the table. But I feel very compelled to see how courageous some of my colleagues have been in terms to advance to really become critical of their own institutions. So I think there's hope.
Well, I think we all can only congratulate Francisco and especially Orlando for the work they are doing and they have done. I mean, it's really impressive. My question is, which are the most challenging issues where people could help? I mean, it looks as if an international collaboration here is necessary and an exchange of experience and also bringing people into other countries and to get some training. What is the relationship, for example, between the museums and education and universities in your country? I would like to learn a little bit more. Is there some kind of education in museums where you can find, I mean, imagine you have 5 positions. Would you find these 5 people to work in the museums? Is there a kind of education in the universities and some kind of collaboration? So, is training available in your country right now? Or how can we help?
Well, in the case of Panama, I'm sure that very few people that are working in these fields, and the evidence of that is the deterioration that both museums and collections have endured in the past 3 decades. If there are people that are working in these fields, they have not identified themselves within this period of time. I do think that in terms of education, we could find people that carry on that job, but in terms of the more technical aspects of museum jobs in conservation and registrars, I think that we need to have people trained for sure.
I think the difference is made by the local training. In the 70s in Costa Rica, they began to teach anthropology and then archaeology, and after several decades now we have a large group of professionals in the field of anthropology, archaeology, but also, how to say, artes plásticas? Fine arts, or visual arts, and so on. Even we had a master program in museology in one of the universities. So what we are needing now is more specialized professionals in particular aspects. I was telling someone yesterday that maybe in exchange of keeping the collections or artifact collections in museums in Europe and the States could be a good alliance or a program of training. I don't think that we don't want back all those objects, but we really need knowledge and support for advanced training and have more investigations in several fields. But I think that will be the difference. Have local training at local universities, because if you send people abroad, that will be 2 or 3 of them, but if you train locally, then you will have many, and some of them will end up working in a very diverse fields concerning with museums or archaeology or any other profession related with the protection of patrimony.
Thank you all for 3 wonderful, inspiring papers. I have a question, but I just want to respond to what you all were saying. So at LACMA in July, we're opening an exhibition of figurines borrowed from Guatemala. And our exchange project is that there are people from the Guatemala National Museum coming to LACMA for a week to study mount making, seismic information.
Awesome.
So, how do you protect your museum and your collections from earthquakes, and how do you make mounts with your, no materials
wire
or good
hangers.
materials? So we at LACMA are absolutely open to that. I know other museums as well, and I think that these kinds of exchanges, as opposed to museums in the U.S. buying more objects, we'd be much happier, which we're not doing right now in our department, is really this exchange of information, and because we learn from you all, and you can learn from what our conservators, et cetera, are doing as well. So, but my question actually has to do with, I loved Francisco's phrase of this kaleidoscopic identities. I don't remember what it was in the museum, in which the challenge is how do you represent a country that has all of these different identities, and I congratulate you to really working towards that. But my question has more to do with also the kaleidoscope of visitors as well, so that you are appealing to many different populations. And in particular, when Agustin was talking about the preparations for the Olympics, I thought, right, of course, that's this flurry of activity in preparation for the Olympics, and all these museums establishing themselves. Mexico on a global stage, or thinking about the 19th century expositions in which Mexico or Costa Rica are presenting themselves to the world again, or when you're talking about the Pope visiting, right? You have how museums really grow with this opportunity to be on a global stage, yet your responsibilities to your people as well. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those tensions of appealing to tourists versus to appealing to local people and education and identity, et cetera.
Well, that's very challenging. We try to identify our public, and first of all, it would be like young people, students. And but as I told you, those students came from different backgrounds and different origins. So how to present an exhibit or a history that's appealing to all of them. And it's difficult. It's difficult now. In the past was everybody was trying to melt. No? Now everybody wants to maintain their own identity. So how to present that? So that's something that we have to deal with. But also we want to present the history of the country to the visitor, because tourism is a very important source of income in Costa Rica. So how to reconcile those views? We are just opening a new a renovation of what's called from the colony to modern history, and that was very challenging, and there have been some efforts to provide this diversity and trying to different discourses or view of realities to the public. But it's difficult. I mean, I don't know if we succeed in that sense, but we are trying. We are conscious of that. I think that would be the first step, trying that we have to address a very diverse public now, and we have to be appealing to the youngers, because those are the ones who are really trying to understand their history by visiting the museum.
And I feel like your UNESCO sites where you have the community
is also,
museums
exactly.
are such a great example where UNESCO puts you on that global stage, but the argument, as I understand, was that you want to really create this connection between the community museum, and the sites, and have them be sort of the caretakers in a way, or feel that connection responsibility of protecting the site.
That is a very interesting case, because that area where the banana plantation was is now composed by the descendants of people that went there to work at the banana company, and they came from Nicaragua, from Honduras, from Panama, and from different parts of Costa Rica. So they are second and third generations of the Oseños now, and the interesting thing is that they are building their particular identity, their local identity, using the pre-Columbian heritage that they cannot say, these are my ancestors, and also the banana plantation remainings. So it's interesting to see an identity in the making, and the role and the need that today inhabitants have of looking to the past and find something that they feel proud of it, trying to say, well, now we have this. It's not our remote past, but it's our recent past, and we feel proud of that. And we just have recently 2 cases where local people oppose the movement of stone spheres from one place to another because they consider that they are theirs and they cannot be moved, even though they cannot trace that property to a very remote past. So I mean, that is the I would say the enchantment of working with recent nations or recent state nations that are still trying to identify the fundamental elements of their identity.
I like to add to that, that the case in Mexico, it's of course in terms of history and different in a way. That what I said a little before was that at this time, probably what we are trying to do is to challenge that idea of Mexico that has been created after the revolution, that would unify it and make it everything solid and perfect, and even challenging the concept that the revolution was just a glorious period of transition into a better life. When you really have to face that it was an atrocious war and that there had been others after that, and really reconcile what has been the differences of politics and points of view, and trying to, instead of telling a story, challenging the story, instead of trying to educate, triggering the desire of learning. And I think that more museums are actually trying to come into a conversation with the audiences now, and understanding that they're completely diverse, and that we deal with a not homogeneous reality as we were thought it was established after the revolution.
In the case of Panama, I think that unfortunately most people think that museums are tourist attractions, and they do not see the scientific aspect of it, or they don't understand it fully. in my perception. So I think that along the lines of inclusion, along the lines of participation of the different communities that we want to represent, we have to have first to cater ourselves. And if people from the outside learn the lesson, in that same avenue, well, that's pretty good too. But first we have to cater ourselves and try to solidify that at least a concept of who we are and who composes this melting pot that we call Panama.
I think that's a really great point to stop. We can continue, we have to have lunch. But of course, I hope you all stay for the afternoon and also the public reception, which will also then be a point where we can have discussions sort of more informally with you all and our speakers. So thank you, and I'll see you all back at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.